Will you ever go camping again after listening to this? It's Em. Thanks for joining us today. Someone asked in the comments for a few stories about camping, so please enjoy. Story 1. For the majority of my childhood and into my teenage years, my family and I would go on annual camping trips. And for a while, we stuck with a very specific campsite that my parents have been going to since before I was born. It was in a really nice area and we never ran into other campers while we were there. It was a really great way to get acquainted with nature. However, we ended up going to a different campsite eventually after something indescribable happened that we all agreed was the weirdest and most terrifying thing that's ever happened to us. Our trips would typically last 3 days and 2 nights, and we typically stuck to the same routine every time. We would set up camp, go for a walk, and then on the second day we would go fishing and all the fun stuff. And on that last day we would just relax until the afternoon and then pack up before going home. It was all in all a really great time and we bonded a lot. And that time was no different at first. The only difference was that I had just turned 13 and my parents finally decided to let me sleep in my own tent. That first night I couldn't have been more excited. I brought a little electric lantern and some manga to read while I snacked in my tent for bed, and that's exactly what I did. Granted, I might have been up too late because by the time I was getting ready to lie down, I realized that I needed to use the bathroom. I tried to be as quiet as I could, and I unzipped my tent and got ready to get out the bathroom when I heard my dad call out from the tent, "Hey bud, you alright?" So let him know what I was doing, and he told me to be careful. I grabbed my lantern and went out into the dark and silent woods, and everything was fine at first. It wasn't until I had started walking back to my tent that I heard a strange sound coming from the woods behind our tents. It sounded like very slow footsteps moving through the tree line. I figured that it was just a deer, though, since we had seen a lot of them earlier that day. So I just calmly walked back to my tent and zipped it up before going to bed. In the morning, however, I realized that I didn't hear a deer. As I woke up and stepped outside my tent, my dad told me to watch my step and pointed ground. I was stunned when I saw a set of massive paw prints pressed into the soft ground, no more than a yard away from my tent. Yet it must have been walking around while we were sleeping, my dad said as he passed me a thermos with some hot tea in it. We talked about the size of the paw prints for a while, and eventually I asked if he thought that it would come back. My dad reassured me though that it was likely just curious about who we were and why we were there. It would most likely leave us all alone, even if it was something dangerous like a wolf. The rest of the day we spent doing activities in the area, but no matter how much I tried to forget about the paw prints, I just couldn't shake them from my mind. And to make things even worse, I was feeling uneasy all day, because I kept feeling like something was watching us as we wandered around the woods. It got to the point where I ended up asking my parents if it would be okay for me to stay in their tent that night, which they didn't have a problem with, and I was thankful for it, because I had clearly made the right choice. That night after we all went to bed, I had a hard time getting to sleep, because I couldn't help but feel like whatever it was that left those prints would be back that night. And just as I was starting to finally drift off, it was clear that I was right. My eyes sprang open as I heard the sound of soft footprints roaming around on the other side of the tents. And as quietly as I could, I woke up my mom and dad. They both sat up when they finally heard that walking around sound that I'd been hearing. And by that point, I was practically having a panic attack. It sounded like the steps were coming right toward our tent. That was when we all heard it. The sound of a snarling animal right outside of our tent. We tried to stay as quiet as we could, but that didn't make any difference. The animal continued to snarl as it slowly drew closer to our tent, and eventually we knew that it was right on the other side of the fabric. We all held our breath this time past that night, and the animal made no sign of leaving our campsite. Over the course of the next couple of hours, we could hear it pacing through the campgrounds, and every now and then it would make its way back to our tent with an eerie snarl. Thankfully, by the time daylight came around, we heard the unmistakable sound of the animal running off into the woods. We waited for a while before my dad finally stepped outside to check the area. Once he said it was clear, we all quickly packed our things and left the area. All the while, we couldn't help but notice all of the paw prints around the camp. That was the last time we went to that campsite, because it was clear that whatever animal that was, it did not want us there. Yeah, OP, you definitely made the right call by staying with your parents in their tent. I don't know exactly what difference it made, other than you guys all being together in case it broke into the tent. I do wonder if it was like a bear or whatever else it could have been, because it seemed really insistent. Story 2. When I was 11 years old, my parents, along with my brother Casey and I, went on a family camping trip to a well-known campground near our house. This place was great. It had a ton of hiking trails, 2 of which led to some really nice waterfalls, and there was a massive lake to go swimming or fishing in. On top of that, there was a lot of really open space so you could bring yard games and stuff to play. So it's usually the best part of our summer vacations. That year, however, was very different. Usually when we went camping up there, we would run into a few families here and there, and sometimes we we would even see people that we knew. But that time we were surprised to see that hardly anyone seemed to be camping. In total, throughout the first 3 nights that we were there, we saw only one other family there, and then on our fourth and final day, we didn't see any families. All we saw was this one person who kept showing up wherever we went. At first, we thought it was just random, you know? I mean, we saw him on our morning hike, which wasn't a big deal, and then shortly after that, we saw him down by the lake while we were getting ready to go for a swim. So for a little while, we really didn't think that there was anything wrong. However, as we were getting out of the lake, I remember my parents drawing Casey and me off quickly before sort of rushing back to the campsite. The entire time I could feel that man that we saw earlier just staring at us. The day continued on, and after eating some lunch, we went on another hike to go see one of the waterfalls. And I'll never forget the skin-crawling feeling that I got as I felt someone staring at us again. And as we walked down the trail, I turned to look over my shoulder and practically jumped out of my shoes when I saw the man from earlier. He was walking pretty far behind us, but I still felt weird about it. So I told my dad that the man was back. My parents tried to pass it off as nothing unusual, but I knew that something was wrong when my mom lied about forgetting her sunglasses back at the tent. My parents directed my brother and me off the trail and through the woods until we finally reached our tent. That was the last time we left the campsite for the rest of the day, and instead we all just hung around the fire playing games with each other. And as happy as we all were, I knew that something was wrong. As the day went on, it started to get dark outside, and my parents tried to convince Casey and me to sleep in their tent with them, but I didn't want to do that, so they inevitably let us sleep in our tent, which is right next to theirs anyway. Looking back on it though, I wish we had stayed in my parents' tent. You see, the night went on and all of us had fallen asleep, though I can't say for how long. All I know is that when I woke up, it was still the middle of the night, and I could clearly hear someone walking around outside of our tent. At first I thought it was my mom or dad using the bathroom, but as I listened closely, I could tell that they were walking up to my tent that my brother and I were in. I could hardly breathe as I heard the sound of the tent zipper slowly sliding upward to open the tent. "Hello?" I said in a choked up voice, but there was no answer. And I'll never forget the next 2 minutes of my life, ever. The strange man that we had seen following us around must have followed us back to our campsite, because I could hardly move as he began to make his way into our tent. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice at all. Thankfully, Casey woke up and he let out a shriek that easily woke my parents up and sent a strange man practically rolling out of our tent. I heard my dad get out of his tent and start screaming at the man as he chased after him. About 2 seconds after this, my mom came into our shed to check on us. My dad never ended up catching the strange man, but shortly after he came back, we all packed up our things and left the campsite in the middle of the night. We called the police and reported the incident, but beyond that, there wasn't anything else that we could do. I feel so bad that Opie got so scared that he couldn't scream. That sounds like something straight out of every nightmare ever. I do wish that someone had been a little more cautious and wary of the random guy following them the whole day. Maybe it's just because I'm a paranoid person, but I know when someone is following me for more than a few blocks, I have to find a way to get out of there safely. Story 3. When I visited my relatives in Florida for the first time, I was really excited to go camping with my cousins. They always told stories about the fun they would have, and this was gonna be my first opportunity to actually see what this was like. And I'll never forget how excited I was to see the campsite that they had set up in the woods behind their house. It had a nice fire pit in the center and a bunch of lawn chairs beside a few tents that were already set up for us. When we first got there, my cousins went to show me around, so we went for a walk. I didn't quite understand why they kept looking at the ground as they were walking, but looking back on it now, I know that they're making sure that there are no alligators in front or near where we were walking. I just assumed they're making sure that they kept solid footing. After walking for a little while, we ended up on a bog near the river where they said they used to fish sometimes. I hadn't gone fishing since my parents moved us up to the city, so I was pretty excited when I found out they had a rod. We all decided to go fishing for a bit and ended up catching a small catfish. But other than that, we didn't really get any bites. After about an hour and a half of fishing, the sun was starting to set and my cousins wanted to cook up some food before going to bed. So we headed back to the camp. Hours passed and one by one, all of my cousins started going to sleep. But for some reason, I was wide awake. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. So before my last cousins went to bed, I asked him if it would be alright if I went out fishing for a bit to relax. And I don't even think he really understood the question, but just said, yeah, whatever. It's all good, man. And then he said goodnight as he went into the tent. I grabbed one of the flashlights and the fishing rod and began walking down to the river. And even though it was about a 4-minute walk, I could easily find the way since it was practically a straight shot. In no time at all, I was casting the line into the water to see what sort of bites I would get at night. Now, it's important to know that I grew up in Montana, and we don't have the same sort of wildlife to worry about as my cousins did in Florida. That's why when I heard a deep hissing sound, I didn't even think to look near the water. I froze up as the hissing continued, and I began looking over my shoulder, expecting there to be some sort of large cat behind me. And as soon as my back was to the river, I felt an excruciatingly sharp pain coming from my right calf. Without even a second to react, I was ripped into the water by an alligator. I let out a scream as I dropped into the water, and I began to kick my other leg as much as I could. Thankfully, the alligator must not have gotten a good bite, because as it tried to pull me further into the river, I managed to get my leg out of its mouth. I was only about a foot away from the riverbank, so I pulled myself to it as fast as I could, and hobbled away from the water in case the gator was pursuing me. And to my surprise, I could see flashlights in the distance as my cousins were running toward me as fast as they could, and yelling for me not to go near the water. When they reached me, they realized that their warning came a bit too late, though it was entirely my fault for not thinking ahead. I had heard about the alligators in Florida, but I wasn't even thinking about them. I was lucky to make it out of the woods only needing a few stitches, because I will never forget what that water looked like when my cousin shined a flashlight at the river. There were literally countless little glowing eyes just sitting on the surface of the water. I was really lucky to make it out of that river alive. Opie said it best. They were lucky to just make it out alive. My brother is moving to Florida soon, and I swear to the good Lord, I refuse to go swimming in anything that is not a chlorine pool where I can see the bottom. I'm already a poor swimmer, and add in alligators, I'd rather take my chances with the Disney adults in Orlando.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.